Hello, my name is Jed Murdoch and welcome to Module 6 on ecological traps and edge effects. In this module, we'll introduce you to the basic idea of an ecological trap. We'll also look at the relationships between traps and edges and edge effects. And a little bit later, my colleague Terry will walk you through a spreadsheet exercise that will demonstrate ecological traps and edge effects and how they play out at a population level. So with that said, let's begin. Anyone who's spent any time watching wildlife knows that habitats are not created equal. We certainly have some habitats for some species that are really high quality. So these might be habitats that have lots of food, they may have less predation, they might be great places to find mates, great places to raise offspring, for example. But we know there are also lower quality habitats too. So there are some habitats that have a lot more predation. There might be more intensified competition, and because of that, they're lower in quality. And when I say quality, I mean that from a fitness perspective. So high quality habitats will have good amounts of biological fitness for individuals. In other words, those individuals will have much higher rates of survival and higher reproductive output, so higher rates of reproduction. Low quality habitats really have the opposite, low rates of survival and low rates of reproduction. And the behavior of individuals and how they use high and low qualities at a population level really has some importance, because as population managers, conservation biologists, we're oftentimes concerned with the fate of populations. So the way individuals are using different habitats with different characteristics and different levels of quality will play out in terms of how a population will behave over a time. So let's consider an example now. Let's look at the bobolink as an example. The bobolink's one of my favorites here. This is a small passerine bird. Many of you might be familiar with bobolinks. We see them quite commonly in parts of North America. And bobolinks are known for these fantastically long, not fantastically, but just long migrations. They end up migrating to South America, as places as far south as Argentina. Really quite a long flight for a small bird. And then they return in the spring and they breed in grassland areas here in North America. And so they oftentimes prefer these nice native grasslands because they have great conditions that result in a high level of fitness. These are high quality habitats. But we also see that a segment of the population will also choose to set up shop, so to speak, to nest, to try to produce offspring in hayfields. And hayfields look very much like native grasslands, but they're actually quite different with respect to quality. We find that hayfields usually have really low quality, and the reason for that is that, of course, mowers go through early in the breeding season in the springtime and mow hayfields, which destroys nests and offspring. So fitness is actually quite low. So we've got high and low quality habitat for this species. We do see, however, that on a yearly basis, when migrants return back to North America, we see that the population in a particular area will continue to use these low-quality habitats. It's as though they're almost selecting them. And you might say, well, why is that? I mean, why would individuals be using these habitats that just aren't any good? They're not very good from a fitness point of view. And so the reason for that might be that these habitats end up being ecological traps. In other words, they look very much like good habitats. So these bobolinks are in some ways deceived into believing that they're really good habitats. So these hay fields may have the same sort of community composition or a good structure and the sorts of things that make a habitat good, but they've got this problem of mowers, right? So they're actually low quality. So an ecological trap is a habitat or an area in a landscape that has low fitness levels, right? So it's got low levels of reproduction, it's got low levels of survival. So if you consider a population that might occupy an ecological trap, that population would essentially go extinct. And the reason for that is that levels are so low that birth rates are much lower than death rates. So deaths kind of overcome birth rates, and eventually this population would sort of swirl down the drain of a sink into extinction. And I use that analogy because in previous modules we've talked about sinks and sink populations. So an ecological trap is just really a sink population. It's kind of the same thing. But the distinction here is that ecological traps, and maybe the insidious part of this, is that ecological traps are preferred, or they're selected, actively selected by individuals. So it's a preferred sink. So our bobolinks, they come roaring back from South America and they look to set up shop and to build nests and breed in the springtime, and they're sort of duped into believing that these hayfields are great habitat when they're really not. So these hayfields act like ecological sinks, ecological traps, you might say. And that's of concern for conservation biologists, right? We know that traps may exist for certain species, and that can lead to extinction in certain circumstances. So if we have a population of bobolinks and this hayfield type habitat becomes the dominant place where breeding occurs, that could certainly cause extinction. So we are interested in learning about how animals use habitats, whether certain habitats represent ecological traps, and if they do, how that plays out at a population level. How will it play out in terms of the persistence of a population? Now we know sometimes that habitat edges can represent ecological traps, especially for some bird species. So an edge is really pretty simple, right? An edge is where two habitats come together. We might have a forest patch, for example, surrounded by a landscape of grassland. So that edge is where these two things come together. And at edges, we know some species do really quite well. So we know a lot of game species here in North America, for example, really flourish in these edge areas. They're able to take advantage of both, let's say, the grassland and the forest that may be at its edge. They can take advantage of both systems here. And in fact, we've actually, from a wildlife management point of view, we have actively promoted the creation of edges for the benefit of those species. But we know that edges aren't necessarily good for all species, and they can be negative for some others. What do we know about edges? Well, at edges we oftentimes see these things called edge effects. And an edge effect might be something like the conditional changes we see at edges. So we might experience as an edge effect higher amounts of humidity or differences in temperature, for example, or differences in how much sunlight penetrates into our forest, let's say. There are a variety of different edge effects. There might be higher rates of predation, for example. So grassland predators might be able to use the edges and penetrate into these forest regions fairly well, so higher rates of predation. So these are called edge effects. And edge effects can be quite significant for some species. So we define edge effects really based on how far they penetrate, right? How far they pervade into our habitat of interest, into our forest, for example. If you consider Douglas fir forests in the Pacific Northwest, parcels of Douglas fir forest experience higher levels of blowdown, lower levels of humidity, and a variety of other edge effects at their margins. And another important point I'll say about edge effects is that they really can change the nature of an edge, and they can almost create a new style of habitat in some ways. And they may penetrate a certain distance, and as a landscape becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, as a parcel of Douglas fir forest, for example, gets smaller and smaller and smaller, that edge effect becomes more magnified. So if we had an edge effect of 160 meters, let's say, which is not unrealistic, we see that in various Douglas fir forests, an edge effect that may be 160 meters. If we had a Douglas fir forest that was 10 hectares in size, the whole thing would be considered an edge. Let's look at a few other edge effects. So here's a graph that shows various edge effects. So these are edge effects that were summarized by Lawrence and others in 2002 in a publication. And they summarize edge effects that were determined as part of something called the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments Project in Brazil. And this project was established in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And it's really a neat project because what they really aimed to do was understand the effects of fragmentation on all sorts of things. They experimentally created, outside of Manaus in Brazil, a variety of different sized forest fragments. Some were small and some were large. And over the years, there have been various researchers and students that have studied this system to determine all sorts of effects of habitat fragmentation. Really a neat study. This graph here depicts the types of edge effects that have been determined over the years, and not only that, the sort of relative strength of those edge effects. On the y-axis here, you've got edge parameters, so that's our edge effect. That's an edge effect that's been determined. And then down here on the x-axis we have the edge penetration distance. So in other words, how far these various edge effects penetrate into a forest fragment, let's say. And you can see a whole variety of different edge effects, and that's partly why I put this up. There are many types of effects that can occur, and some of those effects may be less important than others, but certainly there's some degree of effect. Some things you might find down here on the lower side of the graph don't penetrate quite as far as some of the others. So we see, for example, invasion of disturbance adapted plants only incurring really a small number of meters into the edge of a forest. But if we look here on the opposite side, we see that some things like wind disturbance can penetrate well over, at least 400 meters into a fragment. And that's a pretty substantial level of incursion into a forest fragment. There are other things. There's elevated tree mortality. We've got the invasion of various invertebrates and so forth. So there are a variety of different types of edge effects that occur, and I just put this up to give you some perspective on that.